Let's go on. Thank you, José Ramon. Benvinguts i benvingudes al segon seminari del cicle de col·loquis Energy, Past and Present. Aquest cicle és organitzat conjuntament entre la Societat Catalana d'Història de la Ciència i l'Institut Interuniversitari López Piñero, i avui contem com a invitada amb Cara Daggett. Cara Daggett és professora adjunta al Departament de Ciència Política de Virginia Tech als Estats Units, on investiga sobre ecologia política feminista, en particular els problemes sobre la política energètica en una era de trastorns planetaris. El seu camí cap al feminisme i la política ambiental va començar en les aules de ciència i va titular-se en bioquímica i molt aviat va interessar-se per qüestions relacionades amb les desigualtats en salut. Després va especialitzar-se en polítiques globals per a investigar les relacions entre poder, ciència, tecnologia i el món actual. Una de les seues publicacions més citades es titula Petromasculinity, Fossil Fuels and Authoritarian Desire, on va acunyar el neologisme petromasculinitat per explicar la coconstrucció entre homes i màquines per a perpetuar l'hegemonia masculina i el domini patriarcal occidental en el món gràcies als combustibles fòssils. La professora Daggett és també l'autora del llibre The Birth of Energy, Fossil Fuels, Thermodynamics and the Politics of Work, Duke University Press, 2019. El llibre mostra com els imaginaris culturals del segle XIX, en particular al context britànic, van rebre dues influències fonamentals. D'una banda, la creació d'un nou règim de producció industrial basat en els combustibles fòssils, en concret en l'ús del massiu del carbó, i l'increment de la productivitat del treballador. I per altra, l'emergència d'un nou concepte d'energia entorn a la ciència termodinàmica, que va legitimar els discursos productivistes i allò que anomenem l'imperialisme fòssil. El seminari d'avui es titula Desiring Energy, Toxic Fantasies of Fuel, Freedom and Work. La professora Daggett ens parlarà de les relacions entre energia i treball. Apel·lar a la pèrdua d'ocupacions i l'impacte de l'energia i l'ocupació ha sigut un recurs habitual dels defensors dels combustibles fòssils, però també de les persones que defenien una transició energètica més pausada. La xerrada analitza com el treball va arribar a ser entès i valorat com un lloc de transformació energètica. El tàndem energia-treball permet estudiar l'emergent cultura dels combustibles fòssils i les connexions entre categories com ara la tècnica, els residus, els prejudicis racials o de gènere i la productivitat. De tot això ens parlarà ara la professora Daggett. The microphone is yours, Professor Daggett. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm going to start my screen share. Okay.
Excellent.
It's my pleasure to speak to a lot of historians of science and people across lots of different disciplines. And as the introduction said, I'm coming from political science, but interested in very similar questions. And today I want to hopefully disrupt or problematize how we think about energy and how it is desired, especially in political discourses. So I'm going to talk to you about the research I did into energy and thinking about it as a Western logic and as fundamental to the logic of extractivism. So starting by asking, what is energy anyway? And I think for most of us who are interested in studying energy, it's fuel. That's probably what many of us assume we're talking about when energy comes up, not gravity or how good I'm feeling after my sleep last night or some kind of new age concept. But the thing that we need to drive the economy, to do work. So at the end of the day, energy has this technocratic basis. We think we can count it and make it more efficient or decarbonize it. But as I hinted at, energy is also this very capacious concept. It's a word of modern science, yes, but it's also a popular word in New Age philosophies, meaning life force, flow, and change more broadly. And all of these meanings or feelings about energy mix up in popular discourse about it. So when I started this research, I was interested in this broader cultural and emotional behemoth called energy and how it is understood and in the West. And what I found is that energy reveals how Westerners in particular see themselves as related to the more than human world, as related to the earth. And to give away the answer that I would argue, it's that Westerners believe that what makes humans unique or remarkable is that they are those living things that can and should put the world to work. So this project of putting the world to work is very central to, I think, the history of energy. But I didn't know this when I started researching this book, The Birth of Energy. All I knew was that energy was this rich, complicated thing. And I wanted to know how it came to mean fuel in politics, which is actually pretty recent. It wasn't until the 1970s that we started to get institutions like the Department of Energy, or think about energy as a way to compare different civilizations, for example, in their fuel use. So I was interested in what happened to make energy mean basically the civilizational use of fuel. And so, in other words, I wanted to do what philosopher Michel Foucault calls a genealogy of energy. And that a genealogy means a kind of history where you're asking how something came to be common sense. Some of you may be familiar with Donna Haraway, and she has this great paragraph about how she studies biological cells. And this paragraph became kind of a totem for me when I was thinking about energy. Haraway says biological cells are historical figurations. They are real material things, and they are also metaphor, inflected with language and social values in the connotations of the English word cell and the feelings and histories that word carries with it, relating to boundaries and exchange, prison. So a cell is both material and metaphor, rather than either or, it's both and. So that's how I came or started thinking about energy. And asking just simply about the science of energy and how it emerged and in what context very quickly disrupted some assumptions that I had going into this project. So, oops, sorry. First, I think the assumption that we make around energy in politics is that energy is tightly connected to work. So it's hard to overstate the way that energy and work are connected in terms of both how fossil fuels are defended, but we can also see this rhetoric on the left. So here's a quote from Bernie Sanders, who's a leftist politician in the US, noting that if we start to address environmental problems, we can create millions of good green jobs. And I think that this rhetoric is also very popular in Europe too. Now, the job story is really common and really hard to contest. And my argument in looking at the history of energy is to start to unsettle the associations between energy, work, and well-being. And I did that by thinking about the way that looking at the history of energy, we connect energy is connected to productivism. So this is a quote from Anson Robbenbach in this wonderful book, The Human Motor, saying that productivism is the belief that human society and nature are linked by the primacy and identity of all productive activity, whether of labors, of machines, or of natural forces. So here we have this both naturalization of capitalist and industrial work compared to natural forces in the earth, but we also have the industrialization of the way we think about the work of the earth. And you can see this in the earth of metallic parts on the magazine cover on the right. And in the science of energy, we see this way to connect all kinds of work, not just of human bodies, but also of the earth. So I've kind of hinted at the science of energy in this history, and I want to sort of go and look at how that science emerged in the middle of the 19th century and some of the assumptions about energy that were disrupted by thinking about this context of industrial capitalism and fossil fueled engines. So first, when I came into the project, even though I had training in biochemistry and had taken university level physics courses, my impression is that energy was kind of timeless, or at least very old, like the science of matter is, for example, or force. But actually, energy emerges quite recently, is very much a modern scientific discipline. And many of you may be more familiar with that because this is an audience of historians of science. And I think that this emergence is relevant because it emerges in a time and place where there was a real need to understand steam engines and to make them more efficient. So already among the first so-called discoverers of energy in the 19th century, we have this amalgamation of industrial interests with the pursuit of a certain kind of knowledge. And it shapes, I think, how energy was narrated and also put to work. So the second is the notion that energy is universal. And by that, I mean that energy is this unit, a cosmic unit that helps us understand change, all kinds of change across the cosmos. And what I argue or sort of play out in the book, again, is that energy comes out of fossil fueled experiments. This is not to say that energy is wrong or is not relevant to the cosmos, but rather to understand or think about what happens when we look at that context of scientists tinkering with steam engines and trying to figure out how burning coal could make engines more efficient. And so, for example, we have now in the 20th and 21st century, a lot of sciences that have really quite disruptive and strange notions of energy, or scientists who even, especially in theoretical physics, feel free to play with or tinker with or even dismiss some understandings of energy. We have things like dark energy, which supposedly makes up most of the content of the universe. So all of these ways of understanding energy, even within science, are quite distinct and different from a much narrower engineer's concern with energy, which my argument is that that's what dominates when we think about the politics of energy. So third, I hinted at this idea that energy is the settled concept, or that physics knows what energy is. But actually, the more you dig into the science of energy, the weirder it gets. Not only do we have dark energy, but we have the recognition that energy is not even a thing. It's actually just a set of calculations. In this way, it's more an epistemology, or a way of knowing something about the world, than it is an ontology, an actual thing. Unless you think this is just someone who once studied science and then went off into the humanities and kind of forgot my science, I wanted to show you some of my favorite quotations from famous physicists. This is Richard Feynman explaining that It's important to realize in physics today, we have no knowledge of what energy is. We don't have a picture that energy comes in little blobs of a definite amount. It's not that way. However, there are formulas for calculating some numerical quantity. And then when we add it all together, it gives the same number. And this is one of my favorite quotations that I found from a Nobel laureate physicist named Percy Bridgman in the 20th century. And he says, the laws of thermodynamics have a different feel from most of the other laws of physics. There's something more palpably verbal about them. They smell more of their human origin. Why should we expect nature to be interested, either positively or negatively, in the purposes of human beings, particularly purposes of such unblushingly economic tinge? So I think we see here a scientist acknowledging the kind of smell of human origins around energy, perhaps assuming that this smell of human origins does not leak onto other kinds of scientific knowledge, but nevertheless, really the feeling that energy had this economic tinge from the beginning. So going back to the birth of thermodynamics in the middle of the 19th century, when energy was supposedly discovered, Turner painted this picture right around the same time and place. It's called Rain, Steam, and Speed from 1844. And steam engines had been running for decades at this point, transforming ways of life, transforming the landscape, but they were very inefficient. No one really knew how they worked because we did not understand how heat produced motion. I like to think that in Turner's paintings of a newly industrializing country, you can see the uncertainty and anxiety surrounding these changes to the landscape and to ways of life. The first scientists of energy were motivated by the desire to make this hazy picture more ordered, to make steam engines more efficient, to wreak as much work as possible out of every lump of coal. And to do so, it turns out that you have to get better at tracking this unruly thing that was to be called energy. When applied to governing engines, it could be figured as something like this. So the first law of thermodynamics tells us that the inputs of energy, which here could be fuel, bodies, machines, would equal the energy of the outputs, which could be called the work done. The form of the energy might change, but the underlying quantity remains the same. And so you could track it and see work produced and waste, things like friction. Unfortunately for humans, there's also the second law of thermodynamics, which is that entropy tends to increase. So even if energy is conserved, it tends to dissipate or diffuse into forms that cannot do work or as well. Once a lump of coal is used, you can't have it back. So it also has this unidirectional quality to it, a temporal quality to it. And that means if it's wasted, in the words of Lord Kelvin, who was one of the named to be one of the discoverers of energy, that potential work is, quote, lost to man irrecoverably. Now, in Northern Britain, where this discovery was supposedly made, where also we have an emerging shipbuilding culture, an imperial culture, and Scottish Presbyterianism, which was important to several of the prominent early energy scientists, these measurements and understandings of work and waste were overlain with moral and spiritual meaning from the start. So this slide shows how this model of engines could be applied to the governance of work more broadly, where work begins to be understood as a site of energy transformation. So we already had a politics of work, of course, at this point, that also had a lot of moral and spiritual elements to it in terms of a work ethic. But at this point, we begin to be able to have these tools of quantification and things like ideas of efficiency that could be tracked. All activity could be understood or translated into the terms of energy and tracked according to its efficiency and waste. And human work could be valued through this lens according to its proximity to industrial production. So things like reproduction and care are kind of the supportive basis. Because they use energy, they also demand efficiency. So you get the rise of things like home economics. And those activities that use energy but have no benefit to production are to be tracked down and policed as waste, especially when they're being performed by racialized and feminized bodies. In other words, energy fed into that productivism that we saw in that quote by Robin Bach. So energy becomes then this very attractive tool to serve the project of accumulation. And it's especially useful to the field of engineering, which was also born around the same time in the 19th century, and was a field that was closely aligned to capitalism and for which energy was a very important new scientific discovery. Engineers become the mine managers, the factory experts, and the terms that the way that engineers define these things, work, energy, and power. So work is moving matter, energy is the ability to do work, power is the rate of work done. In energy politics, these physical definitions, I argue, are often conflated with political terms. So the political application then is to use energy efficiently because once used, it's lost forever. Now, in the book, after I sort of go through this emergence of the science of energy, I then turn to think about the way that the desire on the part of scientists to take energy knowledge and use it to think about work or activity more broadly. I think about how this appears in terms of the politics of new imperialism. New imperialism is the term that's often applied to the acceleration of empire in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And it's a period where imperialism is shifting tactics from laissez-faire models of economics to a science of development. And so we have the massive accumulation of information and data and new sciences around studying the colonized world and thinking about both how to gather scientific knowledge from the knowledge of the colonized world, but also how to use that knowledge to both justify and organize imperial control. So in new imperial activities, it's very well known that the fields in biology and ecology are prominent. So things like forestry, disease, studies of climate, geography. These are all, there's quite a lot of literature around how these fields fed into new imperialism, but there's very little, if any, understanding of the way physics, or specifically thermodynamics, for example, informed new imperialism. And in part, this is understandable because it doesn't appear as explicitly in the archive, thermodynamics. But when we look through some of the assumptions that are lying behind, especially sciences of ecology, we can see the understandings of energy, and particularly productivist understandings of energy, informing these biological and ecological sciences. So it's kind of an it's implicitly there. And in particular, this is, it informs the way empire is imagined as an organism. So an organism in which all the different parts of the empire are somehow connected, and the health of one part is directly relevant to the health of the overall organism. Now, clearly, this is a biological metaphor, but the way energy feeds into it is energy is the thing that flows through the organism, the input that then can be used for quote unquote healthy outputs like growth and work, and for ensuring that we minimize unhealthy outputs coded as waste. So in terms of how this plays out, we can see that there was this acknowledgement of the problem of work in terms of governing imperial labor. And in this cartoon, you can see that there was an explicit kind of recognition that the work of the colonies was serving the global north, or what we now call the global north, although it was also depicted in this way in terms of thinking about social Darwinism, that here we have America and England carrying people up the ladder towards civilization. So work, the underpaid and poorly treated work of colonized peoples, that treatment was justified famously on the basis of social Darwinism. And my argument is that social Darwinism often used both metaphors and techniques of energy governance to explain where people stood on this mountain towards civilization. So there was what one historian called an energetic racism, understanding which peoples were more prepared to do hard work or to manage work efficiently, and which tended to be lazy or wasteful. So this project of making workers more efficient then and sort of training workers towards productivism was evident in really the explosion of technical and industrial schools in this period, including the university where I work, Virginia Tech, alongside industrial schools for colonized peoples and people of color. So this is a famous school called the Hampton Institute, also in Virginia. It was in Virginia, and it was for formerly enslaved people. But although it sort of marketed itself as teaching industrial values, most of what it taught students or sort of trained students in was fairly traditional tasks of domestic and agricultural labor, because as racialized people, they weren't deemed to be ready for more kind of industrial skills. And when I was looking at schools like this to see how understandings of energy might have played into the way work was understood and governed at the time, I saw thermodynamic understandings come through in textbooks. And here's an example. This is a quote from a textbook from the Hampton Institute. And this was also a professor at this institute, a white factory owner. And he said that some men should have more capital than others is a necessity from the very nature of things. Perfect equality would be perfect stagnation. The world and its people might as well return to chaos, and in universal nothingness find that universal equality of property preached by the communist and practiced by the highwayman. Now, if you've immersed yourself in not only the science of thermodynamics, but around that science, there were all these concerns about entropy. So for example, that what entropy meant was that the universe was headed towards heat death, which is still actually a hypothesis that some physicists include as a possibility, where all energy eventually will run down or become diffused and life won't be possible. And indeed, life and things like work rely upon differences in heat, or in terms of life, little pockets of low entropy protected by skin or membranes. So here we see this understanding of the nature of things as directly translated into economic terms, into a justification for inequality in capitalism, where economic equality would be similar to a high entropy situation, to perfect stagnation where work couldn't be done and chaos reigned. So alongside this project then of maximizing work, work is set up with the foil of waste. And waste here was and continues to be a social construction based on, cultural and moral values. But with energy, we get this new accounting tool for better governing and tracking things that could be called waste. And it's not that so in other words, it's not that it's totally new, but that we have this physics that gets mapped onto and used to validate, justify, and intensify the policing of waste. So here we have some pictures of advertisements for soap, which was a very prominent commodity, one of the first most popular commodities in the new imperial period. And you can see in the ads that soap was important both as this way of promising cleanliness and purity against the pollution and filth of these massively growing urban industrial cities, but also how this idea of purity was connected to gendered and racialized bodies. So both providing purity against the filth of pollution, but also purity as this move towards civilization, the ability to police and track and partition off the waste that was acknowledged as inevitable to working to the kind of intensification of industrial work. And the feminized kind of bodies, the sort of pure white hands that we see on the right, points to the emergence in this period of the fantasy of the idle Victorian woman as kind of the partner to the idealized middle-class working colonial man. And so what this cultural construction around work does is make, for example, women workers, like these miners pictured in the middle, and domestic workers, sex workers, all sort of further called upon to be increasingly invisible and also increasingly undervalued or devalued. So I want to just, with the last several minutes of my talk, try to take this history that I was looking at in the emergence of energy in the mid-19th century through about the turn of the 20th century and think about what this might mean today for the way we talk about and think about energy today. And part of the argument of my book is that although work has changed dramatically since this period, and although science and technology has changed dramatically since this period, this engineer's understanding, a productivist understanding of energy, still continues to dominate in terms of how we imagine the human relationship to energy in the global north, and particularly hang on to that attachment to high energy or constant energy growth as necessary to human well-being, even through and into a so-called energy transition away from fossil fuels. So in this picture, I'm showing that what's happened in the meantime, as we've increased, we keep increasing this project of putting the world to work, and we keep producing what is coded as waste. But whereas we once, maybe in the 19th century, had this fantasy of waste being partitioned and thrown into away spaces, now increasingly there are no away spaces to put the waste, and the waste is threatening to swamp even the sort of European and American privileged sites of work. And again, we see, I want to bring us back to this way of talking about energy that's always connected to jobs. So here's Biden presenting his climate legislation, and he says, today's climate day at the White House, which means it's jobs day at the White House. And I hope after talking through this history of the way energy gets connected to work, that we can start to understand why this tight association might be problematic and might pose a way to think differently about our relationship to energy and how we contest fossil fuel cultures. So one idea that I offer at the end of the book is I explore a post-work politics that comes out of a feminist tradition. So on the left, we have a really famous advertisement from the Wages for Housework movement in the 1970s, pointing out that capitalism also depends on this kind of reproductive labor that's often underpaid or unpaid. And on the right is a really influential book in this space called The Problem with Work by Kathy Weeks. And in this book, Weeks does not consider environmental dimensions or energy, which is fine because there's a lot that she has to do in this book. But what I am trying to do in the end of my book is encourage further connections between these movements, between the critique of work and a critique of fossil fuel cultures. So Kathy Weeks argues that work has been depoliticized and reified such that it's taken as a natural fact that in order to deserve basic goods and to earn dignity as a citizen, one must work. And I think similarly, energy has been reified and depoliticized. And in the book, Kathy Weeks, in this book with a problem with work, Kathy Weeks recommends two what she calls utopian demands. And this comes from a philosopher named Ernst Bloch. And a utopian demand is a demand that could be feasibly instituted in a current system, but that would be ultimately disruptive, would sort of point towards or open up space for bigger contestations. So the demand in and of itself is not the answer. It doesn't solve everything, but rather it not only poses the potential to disrupt a system, more importantly, perhaps, the act of making these kind of demands creates new political subjects. So she uses the example of wages for housework, where the act of demanding wages for housework helped to mobilize and catalyze the feminist movement and provoke new ways of understanding everyday activities. So the two utopian demands that Weeks forwards in this book are a basic living income and shorter work week. And it's interesting, when I was reading Weeks and I wrote my book, these were still rather marginalized ideas, but even in the last several years, they've become, I think, quite almost mainstream, I think very commonly discussed. And sometimes too, in the realm of thinking about how they might affect climate change or climate mitigation. And again, it's worth pointing out that by proposing ideas like this, it's not about saying this would be the one answer for everyone or would solve all problems or would guarantee a better and more sustainable system. It's rather about how do we make demands where we start to create new kinds of subjects that have a new relationship both to work and to energy. And after doing this history of the science of energy and the ways that we think about and govern energy, I'm more and more convinced that changing our relationship to work and how work is organized is really key to changing our expectations around energy, how we use it, and how we value it. So I want to end on that somewhat positive note and welcome your questions and your ideas and feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cara. It was a pleasure, very interesting talk. So now it's time for questions for the public, for different. You can, all of you know that you can ask either using the microphone or using the chat, and then Jose Ramon and I will read the questions to Cara. By the way, if you don't mind, I can start with a question. I really like also the image you show. In one of the images you were showing a book titled "Welcome to the Anthropocene," which is a question circulating around all your talk. And one of there are many debates, as you know, on Anthropocene, and one of them is when the Anthropocene starts. No, but later in your talk you say energy is born in 19th century thermodynamics. So I don't know if this sentence you mentioned is. We can also understand that sentence as a starting point for the Anthropocene, and also the debate you also know about the Anthropocene and Capitalocene. If you can develop a little bit on this, please.
Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, I do think there is a tendency, and my book is in this tendency, to really emphasize and focus on fossil fueled industrialization as key to the problem, which then risks neglecting the longer history of imperialism and calls to start the Anthropocene, for example, in the period of New World colonization, where we see, I think if I'm remembering correctly, in the ecological record, you can see the effect of a mass die-off of people in the Americas in terms of a reforestation of lands that they had cultivated. And to me, if I was going, first of all, we can problematize picking a date, but I do think histories are important. And I think as long as we know that these are always fictions, or they're always human constructions, and so they have a political use and they're not necessarily natural fact with a capital F. If we're going to pick a date for that purpose, that would be the date that I would pick, which is not connected to the 19th century and the birth of fossil fueled industrialization. And the reason I would pick that date is because I think that date is more important to understanding the way capitalism accelerated, and the way that some of these ideas about how work are valued really get going, that then become inflected by the science of energy. So it's hard. It's a hard thing because it's a little bit both and, but I think it's a really good question for that. What do you all think?
I don't have an answer on that. As you say, it's a very complex debate. And also, in the debate, some people talk about capitalism, but also say or remark the impact of the communist world also in the environmental change and the impact of Chernobyl and other industrial activities. So it's not, and also even it's not just a question of time, but also of the question of place. No, so even in a capitalist world, it's not the same impact of people living in urban areas in the United States or in Spain that people living in rural areas in India or in Africa. No, I don't know. I'm not. Perhaps the debate should consider this kind of issues.
Yes, and there's an indigenous scholar named Kyle Powys White who has a great piece that points out that the world has already ended for lots of people. So this idea of the end of the world, it's not even necessarily a universal experience. I do think, I don't really use the term Anthropocene anymore for all of these reasons, but I do actually appreciate that it was a problematic term that then provoked all this thinking and debate and I think sharpening of our understanding of what's happening. So sometimes maybe it's good to have someone come out and try to put a name to an experience just to have something that brings everyone together around the same theme to then learn from each other.
Yes, right. I don't know. There are people is thinking in their questions still. I have a second. José Ramón, please.
Thank you, Cara, for this talk with so many interesting ideas coming from an area from political science and from critical theory, thinking about the history of energy in this sense. So I have many different questions for you, but let me start by asking you to summarize your idea of petromasculinity. You discuss these gender issues all over your talk, but if you could summarize what you mean by this concept.
Yeah, thank you. So when I was editing the final version of this book for publication, I wrote an article about petromasculinity, and I wrote it I started writing it right after the election of Trump to the presidency, where so I mentioned the book because I think that this study of the history of energy and thinking about work and cultures of energy really helped me make sense of what was happening around contemporary politics of energy, and specifically what I saw and what I continue to see in this country, which is increasingly becoming fascistic, is this defense of fossil fuels and climate obstruction. It's probably not even climate denial anymore. It's more like just obstruction and misogyny. Not only things like we just repealed the constitutional right to abortion in the United States, but there's a real, like one of the key efforts of the far right is anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ. So there are these two things happening, and they're often kind of understood separately, this concern about gender and sexuality, and then this love of fossil fuels. And because I had this background in ecofeminist thought, meaning feminist approaches to understanding how humans relate to nature and how nature too often gets feminized, and the misogynistic treatment of women is women and queer bodies can be related to how the earth itself is conceived. To me, I wanted to write something that understood those as related. And so petromasculinity is a concept that says that fossil fuels are not just material resources or economic interests. They are also symbols that are important, people are attached to because they're important to identities. And I think that's useful to understand when we think about the political obstacles to climate mitigation.
We have a question from Victoria Rodriguez, who is a student of our master program, and she says, what would be your proposal for a better relationship work, energy, human?
It's a big question, and it's a good one. Well, first of all, I would say that my practice as a feminist is very much against the idea of a universal answer for everyone, or that I somehow have the authority or expertise to tell other people in other communities and cultures this answer from the outside. So I think one of my goals first is to dethrone this universal, not necessarily science of energy, but the universal productivist understanding of energy, as if that's what is right for everyone. I think just starting there would be really important. But if it were my community and I was part of that discussion, to me, the problem right now, I think, is that work itself has become valued as the end, and production and growth, even not as a means to something else. So we don't even need to specifically show or enunciate goals for work and energy in terms of well-being. It's just that doing more work is a good thing, or having more energy is always a good thing. So I would like communities to think about well-being as the priority towards which we organize our activities. And that's probably where differences can come alive in how different communities want to define what well-being looks like, and what are the factors that exist in each bioregion that might supply well-being is probably going to look really different, and how decision-making is organized, and so on and so forth. But I'm struck by, there's an article that just came out in the journal Nature Communication that showed that it used an indicator of, I think it called it a decent life, a decent living. And it showed that if we had an egalitarian to provide everyone with a decent life using existing technology and efficiency, would be about 40% of the energy that's currently used. So inequality is a really big driver of this kind of intensive energy use. So part of my proposal too is that when people start to value the well-being of their communities, I think it's a real opportunity to start decreasing energy, not in a way that decreases our well-being, but actually the reverse.
Thank you. We also have a question by Josep Simon, who is a researcher in the López Piñero Institute. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for your talk, Cara. And I would like to ask you two questions. I mean, that you can select one or the other. One is about the role of animals. If what you have thought about the role of animals in the energy questions and capitalism. And the other one is related to morality. You mentioned, for instance, the role of Presbyterianism, and there are these classical essays by Lynn White, this historian of medieval technology, who is talking about the historical roots of our ecological crisis in terms of its connection with the anthropocentrism of Christianity, and then many things in history have been related to religion, and sometimes even to the tensions or differences between Protestantism and Catholicism. I don't know if there is some debate around this in the type of work that you are developing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the first question on animals, to be honest, this is not something I've thought deeply about. I mean, I've thought about it, but it's not something I have had a chance to read deeply on and write on. And I think there's a lot that could be said and done in that regard from animal studies. And there's clear connections, right? Even when we think about how early engines were given the unit of horsepower. There's understandings of how energy use is connected also to the way we conceive of animals as for our use, and which animals are for our use, and which even thinking more broadly about the categories of work and waste, which animals are not relevant to productivism and therefore are treated differently as kind of like extraneous, or the ability to sort of waste them or let them die without having to be responsible for that or feel much about it. So yes, if that's something that you study, I would love to read more about that and maybe hear your thoughts. The second question of theology, so I had very little background in religious studies when I began, and I had to rectify that because it became very clear to me that theology was important, not only in the sense of organized religion, but then the more I understood the relationship between energy and money and all the work that's been done around money as a theological category in so-called secular societies, I really continue to feel that theology is important here. And you mentioned Presbyterianism. So yeah, the scientists of energy in the, especially around Glasgow, people like Lord Kelvin or Joule, they were Scottish Presbyterians, and energy was, so we're in the same period, the same decade almost that we have evolution. And so I have one chapter in the book where I'm comparing evolution and energy in terms of this context. And remarkably, energy seemed to these scientists to be a way to find a middle ground, whereas evolution was much more threatening. And I think because it was more directly related to life and posited in Earth before humans, or an Earth that was indifferent perhaps to humans, energy provided this way for God to still be there, at least as interpreted by some scientists of energy. And I will note that there were German scientists of energy who hated this idea. But one reason Engels really didn't like the science of energy, Engels of Marx and Engels, was because he thought it was this kind of trapdoor through which religion is going to return. So God has a place in energy because of entropy and because of this notion that everything corresponds to the conservation of energy and then the tendency for energy to run down. God alone escapes this fate. So it's kind of, entropy gives us this tragic notion of a fallen Earth, an Earth that was no longer this enlightenment place of balance and harmony as this kind of stable backdrop for human drama. Now we have this Earth that, if left to its own devices, was going to lead straight to death and rack and ruin and chaos. And so like this role for humans to wrest what they could and put it to work becomes not only it becomes kind of a theological mission as well that corresponds well to this idea of thrift and hard work, but it also has this temporal thing. Like there's an urgency there because everything is running down all the time. And if it gets wasted, that's it. It can't be, that was your one chance. So I think it's important that I think that theological angle continues to inform dominant Western ideas about energy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have an additional question, Cara, another another concept you mentioned in your talk, which is imperial waste, and also you were in one of the answers you talk about inequalities and so on. So but my question was about this idea of imperial waste as creating as science and technology creating new inequalities on gender, on race, and the connection with the idea of civilization. And then I was thinking on another concept on political ecology, which is the unequal distribution of costs and benefits, no, in industry and economic systems. So there is also an unequal distribution on imperial waste in terms of distribution of risky works depending on the area and depending on the social class, and also an unequal distribution of imperial waste in terms of the waste, like examples as some toxic products used in India, to toxic products on boats, no, on old boats which were recycled and in theory recycled in India or in the coast of Africa and so on. So could you talk about this, develop a little bit on this, please? Thank you.
Yeah, so in these discussions of the empire as an organism, what was interesting is there were ecologists or ecologically influenced managers writing about the importance of an organism managing and excreting its waste, and sort of acknowledging that the more there was a metabolism in the organism, the more inputs taken in and put to work, the more waste would be produced, and therefore the more governance necessary. Partition to put the waste in certain places that wouldn't threaten the organism. So what's interesting is that although we also have this really important literature around how toxicity and industrial waste is located and placed proximate to marginalized communities, we also have this bigger understanding of this like global organism at work, and those communities and that waste are all seen as kind of extraneous or outside of the project, and waste is put in places where it won't threaten that work project. And that's why I had that image of the earth to try to point to part of the problem being that that's no longer true, or that's becoming more difficult to do. And it does, you could also read in that picture a critique of the Anthropocene as being perhaps the moment when people who are living like I do in a neighborhood, well, I do actually have a toxic waste site several miles from me because I live in a pretty poor former coal field region, but my neighborhood itself is lovely and it's I'm privileged to live here. But increasingly, the Anthropocene is the dawning for more privileged communities of the idea that the waste that's being produced is no longer being partitioned as well, or able to be partitioned. And I think that's why we see the increase of things like borders and walls and gated communities and, attempts to further kind of harden boundaries, which of course are always going to fail. Like the attempt to control flows of certain things is difficult, if not impossible, especially in terms of global warming, right?
Right. Yes.
Did that get to your question?
Yes. You were to the point. Thank you so much. Yes, José Ramón.
Yes, thank you. May I ask a question following the previous question by Joseph Simon on theology and energy? Well, you mentioned that in your book, and that was a very important issue in the book by Crosby Smith on the cultural roots of thermodynamics in Victoria, Britain, in Glasgow or in Manchester. All these theological debates is this idea of creating an idea of energy which fits in this theological discussion. Well, in the book, he discussed how this very local construct could travel to other places. And I probably, that was part of the question that was raised by Josep Simon, how this concept so rooted inside this Protestant culture and this natural theology debates in the north of Britain could travel to other places. And for Crosby Smith and Norton Wise also discussed these things. The point was to follow several paths. No, he discussed how it was appropriated in scientific societies, in the universities, by engineers and naval engineers particularly. And well, my question would be what how these concepts travel abroad, Britain or in Britain, in political science, in the writings of political thinkers, as you mentioned, no? How these concepts were appropriated by political thinkers, by the right and also by the left, because you mentioned Friedrich Engels and the critical remarks, but probably you can find this concepts also in the thinking of Marx, in his idea of metabolic ecosystem, of this ecological thinking of Marx, which is now discussed by many people. So I would like you to develop this idea, how these concepts which emerged in this very particular local context in the north of Britain could travel so easily, apparently, to political science, for instance.
It's a great question, and one of the reasons I was interested in looking at the industrial schools like Hampton and Carlisle, which was a school that was modeled after Hampton and set up for American Indian children who were taken from their communities, is I was precisely interested in how not only how the concepts appear, but how they are used to eradicate other ways of life and other value systems. So I think one very simple answer that I would say how they traveled is by violence. It was part of a much bigger effort with lots of other philosophies and sciences, and it's just one part of the story, but it was one part of a way of justifying the eradication of other ways of life that were ultimately threatening to the project of extraction that gets accelerated at this point. And I think especially in the schools, schools like Hampton or Carlisle, those schools are set up by white people who saw themselves, they were also very Protestant informed, and saw themselves as kind of saviors of formerly enslaved people and of American Indians. So it was this liberal project of, some of these were abolitionists and people who were opposing the wars against American Indians. But the answer then was that what Black children and American Indian children needed was to become better workers. So it's kind of this liberal project of that becomes really important in development and understandings of international development, that, okay, well, we're going to replace a project of outright violence in some places, and we replace it with this logic of development, which is really an imposition of a certain way of life, of a modern way of life premised on waged work, onto other ways of organizing work. So I think there's lots of stories that could be told about where this travels, how it shows up. And it's not just because it is trying to eradicate other ways of life. It's also not just coming from England outward, but also constantly in conversation with these other ways of organizing work, and having to then build itself up, I think, more and more into this totalizing cultural construct against the resistance or threat or appearance of other ways of being. Which is why, you know, in the US, when we think about understandings of the US, it's so almost ubiquitous, the foil of kind of either primitivism that's a fantasy of American Indians, or other tropes about American Indians are really common foils against which America comes to know what America means. And I think you could say something similar about the project of energy and work, that it defines itself against that which it meets in the world.
Thank you very much, Cara. Okay, I don't know if there are more questions. I'm checking in the chat. No, I don't think so. I don't know, Manuel. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Cara, for your talk. I would like to raise a point that is with regards to the terms, or maybe the concepts we're using, because I think that it may be a source of confusion, especially with the word work. So work has a totally, well, maybe not completely different, but very different meaning as related to energy than it has as related to social contexts. So energy captures only a quantitative aspect of work, or better said, work is a quantity that is assigned to a very special feature of processes, which is overcoming resistance across space. This is work. Whereas in political economy, work is a social concept. This was very clear for Marx, for example, who always stressed this point. So there's no smooth transition between energy and work in social terms. One of the first people who tried to attempt this export of the work concept of physics or energy towards political economy was, let me remember his, Sergei Podolinsky. Sergei Podolinsky did attempt to believe that one could use the concepts of physics to more or less characterize work as a social category. And this is why his proposal was not very highly esteemed by neither by Marx nor by Engels. So I believe that there's a problem. There's a problem, and one cannot simply extrapolate what we get from the energy balance in physics to social categories without any further comment. So this is the point I would like to raise, because Otherwise, I believe that we're talking about very different things without noticing. And I think there's a main qualitative difference, which is the fact that work as a social category has another dimension that is not contemplated by energy. Energy is a purely quantitative concept, and you may have very complex value producing work being very little energy consumptive, and the other way around. So they're not directly related. This is what I wanted to say, and I thank you again very much for your presentation, which was very clear.
Thank you. I completely agree with you. I think what you said is very much in line with, or another way of saying the argument that comes out of what I'm thinking. So yeah, I agree. I think the problem is that energy is a quantitative measure, and the concept or category of work is not captured. It cannot be translated into numbers, into a quantitative set of calculations. And yet, what I'm interested in is that there is a desire to do so. That doesn't mean it's successful. I agree. And I think that's why Marx remains really important to me and many others, because Marx is pointing out that value is a really complicated category and is not captured in the drive to commodify, and is not captured by money. Nevertheless, I think we all live in systems that continue to try to value us and put our work into quantitative terms. So it is this desire to translate our work into numbers that I want to take issue with, I think, like you do. And I think to the earlier question I got about what would be a better way of organizing energy, work, and humans would be exactly what you're saying, to recognize that. And so I do explain this in the book better. Perhaps your question tells me I need to include this more in the talk. But when I'm talking about work, I'm especially pointing to a dominant understanding of work within capitalism. And I'm really in agreement with or working with those who are trying to complicate it as you are. So I think, again, to the question of how could we better organize energy, work, and humans would be to think about work much more broadly as meaningful or purposeful activity, and perhaps. And I think that's why I'm also tending to think with feminist Marxists to really emphasize that it's not even just in the realm of production that we should focus, but also what gets siphoned off into so-called reproductive, which I would even argue that those two categories are not really reflecting how activity actually works. But thank you for that. I think that was, maybe you provided me an opportunity to clarify my terms, and that was important. Thank you.
Okay, Cara, thank you. Thank you very much. There are no more questions. It seems that there are no more questions on the chat, and I don't know if there are more questions among the public. If not, we can continue reading Cara in the translation we list at the beginning. We will be also online. We will post the video of the seminar today in the website of Institute. And also, I would like to really thank Cara Daggett for the seminar of tonight, of today, and remind all of you that the next seminar will be November 30 by Anael Marret, entitled Power from Waste as a Solution to the garbage crisis. So as you can realize, Cara, the topic is we continue talking about energy, about waste, about problems and possible magic solutions or not magic solutions to this massive problem on energy. But again, many thanks for your talk, and it has been a pleasure. Yes, please, Josep, you want to say something?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I was just clapping my hands. Sorry.
Okay, so thank you very much, Cara, again.
Bye, thank you all.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, so we can close. Podem tancar el seminari. Moltes gràcies a tots per atendre i seguim a finals de novembre. Salutacions. Tanquem.